At the end of the war, a number of people become obsessed with purging the country of radicals.
You had this sort of explosion of pure American patriotism in 1919. You have the crackdown on the communists and the first real major American Red Scare in 1919. You have a crackdown on a lot of unions. You have a number of spectacularly violent strikes and strike breaking in that year. And all of this is usually attributed to the intensity of the pro-war propaganda campaign, which sort of had no place to go once the war, which was very brief, was over.
And on top of this, there was the growing power of the Socialist Party in America, which had remarkable gains between 1910 and 1917. The Socialist Party won many, many state and local elections. And so you had this sense that there was a relationship between foreignness, between immigration, and between these radical political ideas of anarchism, socialism, and ultimately communism.
Keep in mind, of course, that this is only 2 years after the Russian Revolution, and the Bolshevik menace of Russia was still very fresh in everyone's minds as a new force in the world. But the Red Scare after World War I did not have very much to do with a fear of the military aims of the Soviet Union. It was much more a fear of domestic subversion, and a series of bombings, in fact, that occurred in the United States, in Washington, on Wall Street, and elsewhere, terrified Americans.
Attorney General Palmer and his ambitious assistant, J. Edgar Hoover, orchestrate a series of raids on alleged radical centers, arresting more than 6,000 people.
Without either search warrants or arrest warrants, they had held them in detention for long periods of time without bringing charges against them. They had especially singled out a lot of immigrants, a lot of aliens. The Supreme Court, which in this period was not the most progressive of the courts, at times drew the line or attempted to somewhat moderate this kind of hysteria.
It was really only in some cases that arose out of the Espionage Act in the First World War that the Supreme Court announced that the clear and present danger standard was applicable to freedom of speech. But a point I want to make here is that people went to jail for saying things in the First World War that nobody would have even thought it possible to convict people in the Second World War, during the Korean War, the Vietnam War, of saying those kinds of things. Opposition to the government, opposition to the war, and so on.
Economic problems, labor unrest, racial tensions, and the intensity of anti-radicalism combined to create a general sense of disillusionment.
On the one hand, World War I legitimized a whole range of governmental activities that had not had legitimacy before, and in particular, some of the ways in which the government tried to regulate the economy. On the other hand, the war and the aftermath of the war, when for another year or so there was similar social turmoil over many of the same issues, helped to delegitimize some of the repressive and coercive measures that the government had undertaken during World War I, and make it more difficult for the government to move in that direction in the future.
People were just tired. There had been a great deal of ferment for 2 decades to get people involved and to feel socially responsible. And this culminated, of course, in the great moral crusade of the First World War to make the world safe for democracy, and people were tired of that. Warren Harding ran on a campaign of restoring normalcy in 1920, and as you know, that was a word that he invented. But people knew what he meant, and people were probably glad to have something like normalcy back when Warren Harding became president.
And yet, the legacy of Woodrow Wilson will serve as a reference point for decades to come.
What he did was to provide an historical interpretation, history as art, of the stakes in World War I, what that war meant to the direction of world history, what that war meant to the continued development of the United States, to democracy, to other peoples as well. So the way I describe this to my students is, you've ever seen a Jackson Pollock painting with all the squiggles and squirrels and drips and so on, and you ask yourself, what in the world does that mean? And then a smart aleck comes into the museum next to you and starts talking knowledgeably about the way the painting is constructed. in ways that are not arcane, but actually begin to make sense to you if you pay attention to what that person is saying. So I think that's what Wilson did. I think Wilson was extremely important, our first modern president, because he defines the threats that the United States is going to be facing over the course of the next 75 years. And those kinds of ideas had been making the rounds, to be sure, but it's Wilson who manages to synthesize them and put them together in a convincing way that has resonance with people, that makes events understandable. And that is very much, I think, a great work of political art.
The Unfinished Nation is a 52-part American history series. For more information about this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online at www.intelecom.org.